Nobody told Caden where the pod was. Nobody told him it was there at all. That's the part that stays with you when you hear this story. Not the cold, not the condition of the thing when he found it, but the silence around it. It had been sitting in that alley off Morrison Street in Portland for long enough that the city had stopped looking at it. Somebody had rolled it there, or maybe it had been left during one of the encampment clearances when crews just pushed everything to the edges and drove away. Nobody filed for it. Nobody claimed it. It sat between a green electrical box and a collapsed shopping cart, half blocked by a plywood sheet that had blown against it from somewhere up the street. Caden had been on Morrison for about 3 weeks when he first noticed it. He was 19. He had that kind of hair that grows straight up if you don't cut it. Dark brown, close on the sides and tall on top. Not styled, just grown, the way hair grows when you've got other things to think about. He was thin, but not fragile looking. He wore the same gray hoodie most days, the one with the torn left cuff he'd wrapped in electrical tape so it wouldn't keep unraveling. He had a backpack with a broken zipper on the main compartment, secured with a carabiner he'd found on the ground outside ERI on Morrison. He slept in a doorway near the 7-Eleven when it was dry and under the Burnside overpass when it wasn't. He'd been in Portland 8 months. He was from Boise originally, from a neighborhood called Bench, and had aged out of foster care at 18 with a garbage bag of clothes and a bus pass that expired 3 days later. He didn't think about the pod much the first time he walked past it. He registered it. He registered everything on that block the way you do when a block is where you live, but it looked wrecked. The outer shell was scratched and the color was off in patches, that kind of faded gray-white. One corner had cracked, and someone had stuffed the gap with a plastic grocery bag, which hadn't done anything. The hinge panel on the lid was bent. A sticker on the side said, "Smart Shelter Co." in block letters. He'd never heard of it. He walked past it 4 more times over 2 days before he stopped. What made him stop wasn't curiosity exactly. It was a woman named Diane, maybe 40, who had a spot near the electrical box. She'd been watching him walk by. The 4th time he passed, she said something. She said the thing had been there since at least January, that nobody had come back for it, and that a guy named Marcus had tried to sleep in it once and said the lid wouldn't close right and the interior smelled like something had gotten inside and died. That was in February. Marcus had moved on. Diane didn't want it. She had her own setup, a tent she'd patched herself 3 times with duct tape, and a sleeping bag that worked. She said if Caden wanted to mess with the pod, she didn't care, but she wasn't touching it. Caden moved the plywood sheet. The pod was roughly the size of a single kayak storage unit, maybe a little taller, rounded on top. It was built to stand upright or lie flat. There were rubber feet on both the bottom and one side, and attachment loops that suggested it was designed to be stacked. The hinge panel Diane had mentioned was the entry, a front-opening lid that was supposed to create a sealed sleeping space inside. The mechanism was electric, powered by a small battery pack in the base, and that pack was dead. That's why the lid wouldn't close. It wasn't broken. It just had no power. He figured that out by looking at it for about 20 minutes. He didn't have tools. He didn't have money. He had the carabiner, the electrical tape, and the knowledge of how things work that you accumulate when you've spent years in group homes watching the maintenance guys fix whatever needed fixing because there was never money to replace anything. He had watched a man named Mr. Bautista rewire a ceiling fan in a house in Meridian once. He'd watched another guy named Derek repack a broken window frame with foam and plastic, and watched it hold for 2 winters. He knew that most things aren't as broken as they look. They're just missing one thing. The question was finding what that one thing was. He came back the next morning before the block got busy. He brought a strip of foil from a snack wrapper, a pen, and a water bottle. He was going to figure out the battery situation before anything else. The battery compartment was underneath behind a panel held on by 2 screws. He didn't have a screwdriver. He spent 45 minutes working the screws loose with the edge of the carabiner and a flattened piece of metal he pried off the shopping cart. When the panel came off, the battery pack was a rectangular lithium unit, the kind used in portable power stations. Not unusual, not rare, It had swollen slightly, classic over-discharge, but the terminals were clean and the casing hadn't cracked. The battery itself might have been fine. It just needed a charge it had never gotten. The problem wasn't the battery. The problem was getting power to it. This is where most people in Caden's situation would have stopped. No outlet, no cord, no money for a charging solution. The pod was dead, and it was going to stay dead. That's the assumption that had kept it sitting there for months. Diane's guy Marcus had assumed it. The people who walked past it every day had assumed it. Caden didn't stop because he'd seen something the week before that he hadn't forgotten. There was a church 2 blocks up on Morrison, St. Francis, a Catholic place with a side entrance that faced the alley. That side entrance had an outdoor outlet, the kind mounted in a weatherproof box used for Christmas lights or exterior equipment. Caden had noticed it because he'd been sheltering in that doorway and seen the box, and noticed the outlet cover was loose. He hadn't thought much about it then. He thought about it now. He needed a power cord. Not a special one, any standard cord that could reach from the side of the church to where the pod sat. The distance was about 40 feet. He spent the rest of that morning walking the block collecting cord. There was an extension cord tangled in the chain link at the far end of the alley, orange, dirty, but intact. He pulled it free and checked it end to end, found a small cut about 8 feet from one end that he wrapped with electrical tape 3 times. There was a second shorter cord in the pile of debris near the overpass, 3 feet with a 3-prong end. He connected them. He now had roughly 43 feet of workable extension cord. He went to the church. He wasn't going to take power without asking. That part matters. He knocked on the side door and a woman answered, maybe 60, in the kind of practical clothes that people who work in churches wear. Dark slacks, a gray cardigan. He told her straight, there was a shelter unit in the alley down the block. It needed to charge its battery, and he was asking if he could plug a cord into the outlet on their exterior wall for a few hours. He said he'd check back. He said if she wanted to watch, she could watch. She asked how long. He said he didn't know, maybe 6 hours. She said yes. She said she'd leave the outlet unlocked until 4. He ran the cord. The pod's battery pack connected via a standard DC port that he'd found under a rubber cap when he pulled the lining away from the left interior wall. That part had taken another 20 minutes. The port wasn't obvious, and the rubber cap had been pushed in rather than pulled out. So he'd spent time trying to figure out if he was looking at a vent or a port. It was a port. He connected the cord through a small adapter situation he jury-rigged using the shorter cord's stripped end and a connector he'd pulled from a dead phone charger he found in a donation bin outside the church. It wasn't perfect. It was enough. He left it. He came back at 2. The battery indicator light on the pack, a small LED strip he'd discovered by accident when he brushed debris off the underside, was solid green on 2 of its 4 segments. He came back at 4. 3 segments. The woman from the church came out at 3:40 and asked if he needed another day. He said maybe 1 more hour. She left it on until 5. The lid closed that evening. It made a sound when it sealed. A soft mechanical click, then a low hiss that lasted about 3 seconds, which he later figured out was the insulation layer pressurizing slightly. He was inside when it happened. The interior was about 6 feet long and 3 feet across at the widest point, with a slight rise in the center so a person could turn onto their side without pressing against the ceiling. There was a thin foam pad bonded to the floor, dirty and compressed from however many months it had sat, but present. The interior temperature, within about 4 minutes of the lid closing, had changed noticeably. Not warm, but not the damp cold that had been in that alley at 5 in the evening in March. Something in between. Something that felt like the temperature had stopped moving. He stayed in there for a long time before he opened it again. The hinge panel had a manual release inside, a small handle, red set into the wall near his left shoulder, and when he pulled it, the lid opened cleanly. He sat up. Diane was watching from her tent. He didn't say anything. She nodded. The next 3 days were about finding the gaps. The crack in the corner was the biggest problem. The pod was insulated. There was a layer of rigid foam between the outer shell and the inner surface, but the crack let air through, and cold follows air. He found a tube of silicone sealant in a hardware store's discount bin outside a rebuilding center on NE Oregon Street, marked down to almost nothing because it was missing the cap and had partially cured in the tube. He cut the cured section off. There was still enough inside. He worked it into the crack with a piece of wire and pressed a strip of the inner plastic bag from a chip wrapper over the top. While it cured, it held. The smell was real. Marcus hadn't been wrong. Something had gotten into the pod. A bird, probably, based on what he found when he pulled the foam pad loose, and had died in the space between the pad and the floor panel. He removed the pad, cleaned the space with water and a rag he boiled in a pot over a camp stove he borrowed from a guy named Terry 3 blocks away, let everything dry for a full day with the lid open, and put the pad back. The smell didn't completely go. It went enough. The battery situation was going to repeat itself. He couldn't run a cord from the church every time the battery died. That part took him another week to figure out. What he found, and this is the part that most people wouldn't think to look for, was that the pod had a secondary power input on the exterior, a solar input, a small rectangular port, barely visible under a UV-yellowed rubber cover on the top rear of the shell. He had no solar panel, but he knew what a solar panel port looked like because he'd seen them on the emergency power stations in the group homes, the ones they broke out during outages. This was the same port, same size. A portable solar panel that would charge the pod's battery was not something he owned. He'd looked them up once on a library computer. The good ones cost $120, the decent ones cost $60, and the passable ones cost $35. He had none of those dollars. He found a panel 7 days later, not bought, found, leaning against a dumpster on NE Broadway, cable still attached, in a cardboard box that also contained a broken Bluetooth speaker and a tangle of USB cables. The panel was cracked across one cell. About a third of its surface was damaged, but 2/3 of a solar panel in Portland in March still gathers something. He tested it with a multimeter he borrowed from a man named Roosevelt who had an organized cart and knew electrical things. The panel output was reduced but present. He connected it to the pod's solar port. Over the next 4 days, the battery recharged to full. He moved the pod. This is important. He didn't try to stay in the alley off Morrison. The alley was semi-public, and the pod was visible, and the city had a habit of clearing anything that looked like a structure, regardless of whether it was occupied or owned or abandoned. He needed somewhere the pod could sit without being immediately flagged. There was a lot 3 blocks east, a narrow strip between 2 buildings that had been used for storage and then emptied, with a chain-link fence at the back and no signage prohibiting presence. The lot was accessed through a broken section of fence on the alley side. 5 other people used the lot regularly. One of them, a woman named Priscilla, who was maybe 53 and had been in Portland for 6 years, had a van she slept in on the south side of the lot. Caden asked Priscilla if he could bring the pod into the lot. He explained what it was. She said she'd seen them, said she thought they were from one of the tech companies that had run a pilot program for emergency housing years back, that the program had ended before it went anywhere, and that a few of the units had apparently gotten dispersed when the storage facility holding them had cleared out. She said she didn't know if that was true. She said she didn't care where the pod came from, just that he needed to help her move the van 2 feet to the left to make room, because she'd been meaning to move it for 3 weeks. He helped move the van. The pod fit along the north fence. He positioned it so the solar panel, which he'd secured to the top with zip ties salvaged from the same dumpster pile on Broadway, faced south-southwest for maximum afternoon exposure. He ran the panel cable under the rubber cover and connected it. He set a piece of rebar against the closed lid. Not a lock, but a signal that the thing was occupied and shouldn't be opened. That first night in the lot was different from the alley. In the alley, there'd been ambient noise from Morrison Street, and the feeling of being exposed on 2 sides. The lot was quieter, the pod sealed. He pulled the lid closed and lay there in the dark and listened to the temperature stabilize. It took longer than it had the first time, maybe because the night was colder. 40 minutes roughly before the interior felt like it had reached a floor. Not warm, but not dropping anymore. The difference between a temperature that's falling and one that's stopped falling is something you feel before you understand it. He felt it. He slept through to 6 in the morning. Full sleep, uninterrupted. The first time that had happened in Portland. This doesn't mean the pod solved everything. That part needs to be said plainly. The pod solved the cold. It solved the specific problem of sleeping exposed in 38-degree weather with insufficient bedding. It did not solve the fact that Caden was 19 and had no ID that wasn't expired, no work history that was documented, no address for applications, and no clear path to any of those things from where he was standing. Those problems were still there when he woke up. They were there the morning after, and the morning after that. But he wasn't cold. There is something that happens to a person's thinking when they're not managing cold. It's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced the alternative, cold that's present all night, the kind that wakes you every hour and keeps you doing a constant low-level calculation about survival, occupies a specific amount of cognitive space. When that calculation stops, something opens up. It's not inspiration. It's not sudden clarity. It's closer to the absence of noise. The thinking that was behind the cold noise was always there. Now it could move. He started going to the library on Burnside every morning, not for warmth, he had that now, but because the library had computers with 2-hour sessions, and he needed to figure out what an expired foster care ID could get him, and what it couldn't. He learned that Oregon had a program specifically for people who'd aged out of foster care, that it was administered through DHS, and that getting into it required an in-person appointment that required showing up at a specific address on a specific weekday morning. He learned this over 3 library sessions, not 1. The website was poorly organized, and half the links didn't work. He printed 3 pages of information on the library's printer. 10 cents a page, 20 cents he borrowed from Priscilla, in exchange for helping her check a noise her van's engine had been making. The appointment was on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after he moved the pod into the lot. He showed up. He had the pod to go back to. He had slept. His thinking was clear enough to fill out the forms without making errors, to answer the questions without the baseline desperation that makes caseworkers uneasy and slows things down. He got into the program. It took 4 more months. 4 months during which he lived in the pod, during which the solar panel kept the battery charged on good days, and during which he walked to the church on Morrison, on the bad ones, and plugged in with permission, during which he borrowed Roosevelt's multimeter twice more to check the system. But at the end of those 4 months he had a room, an actual room in a transitional housing building on N.E. Sandy, shared bathroom, his own door, a key. He left the pod in the lot. He told Priscilla about it before he left. He told her how the charging worked, where the manual release handle was inside, what the solar port was, and what it needed. He showed her the outlet on the church, on Morrison, and told her about the woman in the cardigan whose name he'd learned was Sister Claire, who had said yes the first time without making him explain himself more than once. Priscilla listened to all of it. She was 53 years old and had been in Portland for 6 years, and had information from that time that she'd already used to help other people in the lot. Information about which shelters had which rules, and which city offices had which hours, and which dumpsters behind which grocery stores on which nights were worth checking. She added the pod to what she knew. She started telling people. The pod is still in that lot, as of the last time anyone checked. A different person sleeps in it now. The crack in the corner has been resealed twice more since Caden did it the first time. You can see the layers if you look. The solar panel has a second piece of tape over the crack in its cell, which someone added at some point to try to extend its output. The rebar is still there, leaning against the closed lid. What Caden found wasn't a solution designed for him. The pod was made for something else, aimed at something else, by people who imagined a different kind of user. The sleeping pods that showed up in Portland's encampment landscape during those years were mostly prototypes and pilots, designed for tech campuses, for music festivals, for airline lounges, for the kind of temporary sleeping that wealthy people do between connecting flights. They were not designed for a 19-year-old from Boise with a dead battery and 40 feet of salvaged extension cord. The gap between what they were made for and what they could actually do, that gap was the thing nobody had bothered to cross. Caden crossed it because he didn't assume the thing was broken. He assumed something was missing. Those are different assumptions, and they lead to different actions. The one thing worth taking from this, if you take anything, is that 1. Not the solar panel trick, not the silicone sealant, not the church outlet. The assumption, most things that look broken aren't broken. They're missing one thing. The question is whether you stop at the look or whether you get close enough to find out what the thing actually is. That's not an easy thing to do when you're cold and tired and 19, and the city treats the alley where you live like it doesn't exist. It wasn't easy for Caden. He did it anyway, on a block where nobody had bothered to look at a pod that had been sitting there for months, in a city that had long since stopped paying attention to it. The lid closed, the temperature stopped dropping, he slept. What the pod won't fix, and this is the honest end of it, is the thing underneath. A sealed sleeping space in a lot in Portland doesn't fix a system that sends 18-year-olds out of foster care with a garbage bag and a 3-day bus pass. It doesn't fix the documentation gap, the ID gap, the work history gap. It fixes one night, then the next one, then the one after that. And it turns out that when you fix enough of those, the other problems become possible to solve. Not easy, possible. There's a difference, and it matters, and Caden knew it better than most. He knew it because he'd felt it. That specific moment when a temperature stops falling and you realize you're going to be okay until morning. That's what the pod did. That's all it did. That was enough.